So let's get into the real purpose for this app and section, shall we? Which is to learn about web requests and learning how to communicate with APIs. This is an extremely important skill for you to have as a developer. So many apps need to communicate with the internet, with servers and APIs to retrieve and display the information for the user to consume. So first off, what is an API? API stands for Application Programming Interface. The API we are going to be using is called SWAPI.co, SWAPI, the Star Wars API. I don't know if other people call it SWAPI, but I do. And how it works is that you enter in a specific URL, like you see here, https://swapi.co/API, and then people/1. Now this right here, this is the base URL, okay? And then here we have things that you can append to it, something like people/1, planets/3, starships/9, and you see that each of these ends up with a different result. Now this is called an endpoint, okay? This is a specific URL that returns information that resides on the server at this address. Okay, so we have our base URL, and then as a whole, each of these is a route. So let's take a look at this route, people/1. And you'll see here we have a jumble of text here. We have information like name, Luke Skywalker, height, 172, mass, 77, etc. And this is called JSON, okay? It stands for JavaScript Object Notation. It is probably the most common format for structuring data that is transmitted over APIs. It is lightweight, easily readable for humans, and easily parsed by computers. A JSON object begins and closes with a curly brace, okay? So you see we have a curly brace here and a curly brace down here. So this is all one JSON object. And its contents consists of key and value pairs, okay? So this is the key and this is the value, kind of like with Swift dictionaries. The key is always a string, but the value can be a string, an integer, a boolean, or even another JSON object. Here you can see that we have an array of strings, and you use the key to retrieve the value, again, just like with dictionaries. So this site has a nice GUI, graphical user interface, for us to view the results of the API call. But when it comes from the server raw, it doesn't quite look like this. So we can actually see this if we copy this base URL. I'm going to open up a new tab, paste that, and then add to it people/1. And you'll see here it says Django REST Framework. So if I search for that, then you'll see here the results of this API call. And it still looks pretty good, actually. This is being formatted for us by Django, but you can see here a little bit of extra information. We have HTTP 200, okay. So this is the response code for the request, and 200 response code means that everything went well and okay. But let's check out how else it might also look. Let's go to a different API called the Poke API. And if we go ahead and copy this one, and then we open a new tab, paste that, and do Pokemon/1, you see all of this. And wow, this does not look easily readable like I said that JSON is. But we have resources that can help us and format this for us. So do Command A, right here, click on this part and do Command A, and then Command C to copy it. Open up a new tab and search for JSON formatter, okay? And there are several. I usually use this top one, jsonformatter.curiousconcept.com. And all you do is just paste in that wall of text and say process. And then down here, we have the results. It says valid JSON. And we can kind of drag this out a little bit. And then we are able to more easily browse that information. We see we have forms and abilities, stats for this Pokemon. And yeah, so I just wanted to show you how you might see JSON returned and it might look ugly. And just so you know that there are resources that can format that in a nice way for you. So we can see that we can make a web request. All we did was put this URL into a browser and we get some information back. But what is actually going on here? For that, let's take a few steps back and talk about what web requests are actually doing. Let's start out with a website. Say you go to iOS12masterclass.com and you see this lovely website. How is this showing up on your computer? Where did your browser get the information and know how to display it? First, let's talk about something called HTTP, which stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol. And you probably recognize this because it's at the front of all of your websites. So it's a protocol or a standard. This website is abiding by this standard. So we can use this protocol to send and receive information in a text format. And we are sending that information between clients, like browsers and mobile devices, and servers. And the server is where the specific data for that website or API is stored or hosted. So let's say we have our browser here and an iPhone. These are a couple of clients. And we want to go to iOS12masterclass.com, which has content hosted on a server. All the HTML, CSS files, JavaScript, whatever that website needs to be displayed is hosted on that server. And when you type in the URL for iOS12masterclass.com, you are sending an HTTP GET web request to a very specific address on the server. Basically, we are saying to the server, hey, can you show me this website, please? And if everything checks out on the request's end and everything is working on the server's end, the server will say, yeah, sure, I can show you the iOS 12 site. Then it will return an HTTP response which contains information like header and body. And the body is going to have the HTML, CSS, etc., everything that the browser needs and knows how to interpret to display it as the website that you see. Now let's take a look at this process from an app's perspective, specifically our Star Trivia app. Now our app is going to be communicating with the Swappy API, and an API is code that is hosted on a server somewhere. It can receive web requests, process information, send data to a database to be stored, and return data to the requester. The Swappy API is going to simply return data to us when we request it at certain routes or URLs. The way we request data is using what is called a GET request. This is one of 4 main types of HTTP requests: GET, POST, PUT, and DELETE. There are more, but these are the 4 that you'll use the most often. A GET request is simply making a request to a server at an endpoint and expecting to receive information back. An endpoint is simply a specific URL. So in our Swappy API, the /people, /vehicles, /starships are all endpoints. And what we get back is that JSON that we discussed earlier. So to show what this would look like, we have our app here. And when I press random button, we are generating a random number, putting it at the end of this endpoint, and making a GET request to the API. The API receives the GET request, and if everything is okay on the request and server side, it will return the JSON. The app then receives the JSON, parses it, or in other words, turns it into a usable form, which in our case will be to create an instance of a class or structure using values from specific keys. That instance is then used to update the UI and display to the user. Now, before we move on to the other request methods, I should note that this API that we're using is an open API, meaning anyone can hit these endpoints. A lot of APIs require you to register and get an API key. For instance, this is my OpenWeatherMap account, and I have here an API key. Okay, so it's typically a long string of random numbers and letters. So let's see how that works. Let's click on API here, and let's go to the current weather data, and let's click on one of these example API calls here. All right, so here we get returned coordinates, longitude, latitude, the weather, descriptions, and if we click here on the URL, you'll see here that at the end, we see a and app ID equals, and then we get this long string of letters. So this is the API key. So the only difference between this and the Star Wars API is that you will be required in whatever form that the API dictates that you'll need to include your API key. And if you do it incorrectly, or if you're trying to access it without an API key, you will get, let me go ahead and modify this to break it. And I just deleted some parts of the API key and removed the samples part, and press enter. You'll get this, code 401, invalid API key, okay? And real quick on these response codes, we already discussed a 200 response code, which means that everything is okay, everything went well. If you get an error in the 400s like this, it is most likely your fault. The URL is not formatted correctly, you don't have correct access, or you misspelled something. If you get an error in the 500s, the server is having issues, in which case there's not a lot you can do unless you're also maintaining the server, but you might just have to make a call to your backend engineers. Okay, so now let's talk about the post HTTP request method. Sometimes you need to send information to your server, like when you log in, you send your email and password. This is sent in the body of the request. You might also be sending a bearer token, which is an authorization method to make sure the requester is authorized to send or retrieve data from the server. So the post method is used to send data to the server, where the server can process it and act accordingly. The put method is used to update an existing object in the database, and the delete method is used to, well, delete an object in the database. And that is how web requests work with our apps and APIs to get information into our application. Just to recap, we make a web request, that could be a GET or a POST request, to our API, which will then return data to us if we have access and everything is working correctly. And then in our app, we can parse that JSON data into usable instances of our classes and then display that to our users. All right, so in the next lesson, I'm going to introduce you to a very useful tool when you are working with APIs called Postman. All right, so I'll see you there.